Bernie, Al Gore and I are committed to making America's public schools the best in the world, and I disagree with what my opponent has said. A lot of progress has been made in recent years. Average testing scores are up, and a lot of extraordinary work is being done by tens of thousands of parents and teachers and administrators all around America. But there's more to be done. And if you will allow me, I want to go back to your last question because it leads to this question. I think both of us agree that leaving aside the Social Security and Medicare surpluses, there's $1.8 trillion in surplus available to spend over the next 10 years. As I said before, we're being fiscally responsible about it. We're taking $300 billion off the top to put in a reserve fund. The rest of it we're going to use for middle-class tax cuts and investments in programs like education. Now, there's a big difference here between these two tickets. Our opponents are going to spend $1.6 trillion of the $1.8 trillion surplus projected on that big tax cut that Al Gore talked about the other night so effectively. We're saving money to invest in education. You cannot reform education and improve it in this country without spending some money. Al Gore and I have committed $170 billion for that purpose, to recruit 100,000 new teachers, to reduce the size of classrooms, to help local school districts build new buildings so our children are not learning in crumbling classrooms. And we're not just going to stop at high school. We're going to go on and give the middle class the ability to deduct up to $10,000 a year in the cost of college tuition. Now that's a tremendous life-saving change which will help people carry on their education and allow them to develop the kinds of skills that will help them succeed in the high-tech economy of today.
Very important issue, Bernie. Maybe we could extend on education for a moment.
You're asking me to invoke the moderator's discretion
I am
on further
asking
discussion?
You to invoke the moderator's discussion. Yes, sir, discretion.
It is so granted.
Thank you, sir.
Your Honor, do I have a chance to respond?
Of course you do.
Thank you.
The Secretary will have 2 minutes, and then you will have 2 minutes.
Thank you.
Let's talk about this question of the surplus, because it really drives a lot of what we're talking about here, Joe. And if you look at our proposal, we take half of the projected surplus and set it aside for Social Security, over $2.4 trillion. We take roughly a fourth of it for other urgent priorities, such as Medicare reform and education, several of these other key programs we want to support. And we take roughly one-fourth of it and return it in the form of a tax cut to the American taxpayer. We think it is extraordinarily important to do that, but it is a fundamental difference between our two approaches. If you look, frankly, by our numbers and the numbers of the Senate Budget Committee, which has totaled up all the promises that Vice President Gore has made during the course of the campaign, they are some $900 billion in spending over and above that projected surplus already, and we still have a month to go in the campaign. The fact is that the program that we put together, we think, is very responsible. The suggestion that somehow all of it is going for tax cuts isn't true. Another way to look at it is that over the course of the next 10 years, we'll collect roughly $25 trillion in revenue. We want to take about 5% of that and return that to the American taxpayer in the form of tax relief. We have the highest level of taxation now we've had since World War II. The average American family is paying about 40% in federal, state, and local taxes. We think it is appropriate to return to the American people so that they can make choices themselves on how that money ought to be spent, whether they want to spend it on education or on retirement or on paying their bills. It's their choice. It's their prerogative. We want to give them the opportunity to make those kinds of choices for themselves, and we think this is a totally reasonable approach.
Senator?
Bernie, let me start with the numbers. So with all respect, the Senate Budget Committee estimates that Dick Cheney has just referred to are the estimates of the partisan Republican staff of the Senate Budget Committee. We're using the numbers presented by the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. And we start with an agreement, which is that the surplus in the Social Security Fund should be locked up and used for Social Security. That's where the agreement ends. We also agree and believe and pledge that the surplus in the Medicare Trust Fund should also be locked up with a sign on it that says, "Politicians, keep your hands off." Our opponents do not do that. In fact, they raid the Medicare Trust Fund to pay for, well, their tax cut and other programs that they can't afford because they've spent so much on the tax cut. Let me come back to the remaining $1.8 trillion that we both talked about. The numbers show that $1.6 trillion goes to that big tax cut, which, as Al Gore said the other night, sends 43% to the top 1%. But really worse than that, when you add on the other spending programs that our opponents have committed to, plus the cost of their plan to privatize Social Security, by our calculation, they are $1.1 trillion in debt. And that means we go back down the road to higher interest rates, to higher unemployment, to a kind of stealth tax increase on every American family, because when interest rates go up, so too do the cost of mortgage payments, car payments, student loans, credit card transactions. So if we've learned anything over the last 8 years, it is that one of the most important things the government can do, the federal government, probably the most important, is to be fiscally responsible. And that's why Al Gore and I are committed to balancing the budget every year, in fact, to paying off the debt by the year 2012, when by our calculation, our opponent's economic plan still leaves America $2.8 trillion in debt.
Time. The next question goes to you. Gentlemen, this is the 21st century. Yet, on average, an American working woman in our great nation earns 75 cents for each dollar earned by a working male. What do you males propose to do about it?
Well, it's a good and an important question. Obviously, in our time, fortunately, great advances have been made by women achieving the kind of equality that they were too long denied. But Bernie, your question is absolutely right. Women, actually the number I have, is receive 72 cents for every dollar a man receives in a comparable job. Al Gore and I have issued an economic plan in which we've stated specific goals for the future. And one of those goals is to eliminate the pay gap between men and women. It's unfair and it's unacceptable. And the first way we will do that is by supporting the Equal Pay Act, which has been proposed in Congress, which gives women the right to file legal actions against employers who are not treating them fairly and not paying them equally. Secondly, we're going to do everything we can using governmental support of business agencies such as the Small Business Administration to help women business owners have an opportunity to invest and begin businesses and make larger incomes themselves. And there are other civil rights and human rights laws that I think can come to play here. So bottom line, this is an unfair and unacceptable situation. And even though as the economy has risen in the last 8 years, America's women have risen with it and received more income, until women are receiving the same amount of pay for the same job they're doing as a man receives, we've not achieved genuine equality in this country. And Al Gore and I are committed to closing that gap and achieving that equality. You know, in so many families, women are a significant bread earner or the only bread earner. So this cause affects not only the women, but families and the children as well.
Mr. Secretary.